March 4th, 2002 was a Monday. In the town of Elk City, Oklahoma, 6-year-old Nora Calloway woke up early because she always woke up early on the mornings her father left for a long haul. She had developed, in the way that small children develop rituals around the things they love and fear losing, a precise sequence for those mornings. She would get up before her mother. She would put on her slippers and her robe. She would go downstairs and sit at the kitchen table and watch her father move through his pre-departure routine, the thermos of coffee filled to exactly the same line every time. The logbook checked, the set of keys lifted from the hook by the back door in a specific order, the jacket zipped 3/4 of the way up and never all the way, because Ray Calloway ran warm and always had. She would watch all of this and she would not speak, because she understood, without anyone having told her, that speaking would make the leaving feel more real. Ray would always notice her anyway. He would come to the table and crouch down to her level and say the same thing he always said. "Back before you know it, bug," and she would nod. And he would kiss the top of her head. And he would go. On March 4th, 2002, Ray Calloway kissed the top of his daughter's head, told her he would be back before she knew it, walked out the back door of the house on Sycamore Street, climbed into his blue Kenworth T680, and drove west on US 40 toward Amarillo, Texas, where a load of industrial equipment was waiting to be picked up and hauled to Albuquerque. He was never seen again. Nora Calloway is 28 years old now. She has her father's eyes, dark and steady, the kind of eyes that suggest they have seen more than their age should account for. She works as a librarian in Tulsa, a job she chose, she has said, because she has always believed that the answer to any question is somewhere, written down, waiting for the right person to find it. She drives a second-hand pickup truck. She keeps a journal. And for the past 10 years, on the first weekend of every month, she has driven a route that follows as closely as she can reconstruct it, the last road her father traveled, stopping at every truck stop, every diner, every rest area along the way, and leaving behind a small handwritten note. The notes are simple. Her name, her phone number, a photograph of Ray Calloway, broad shoulders, dark hair going gray at the temples, the particular smile of a man who finds the world genuinely amusing, and 6 words beneath the photograph: "Have you seen my father? Please call." She has left over 800 of those notes in 22 years. In truck stop bathrooms, tucked behind condiment holders, folded into the pages of drivers' logbooks left on counters. Pinned to community bulletin boards in diners from Elk City to Flagstaff, she has received, across all those years, 47 phone calls. None of them had led to Ray. Most had come from people who wanted to help and had nothing useful to offer. A few had come from people who claimed to have information and then disappeared when asked for specifics. One had come from a man who said he had worked with Ray in 2003, a year after Ray had disappeared, which Nora had passed immediately to the Beckham County Sheriff's Office, where Ray's case had sat in the cold case files since 2004. Then, on a Tuesday evening in October 2024, her phone rang with an Oklahoma area code she didn't recognize. The woman on the other end of the line was 81 years old. Her name was Estelle Briggs. She had worked as a cook at the Crossroads Diner outside Amarillo, Texas, for 31 years before retiring in 2019. She had found Nora's note that afternoon, tucked behind the sugar dispenser at a truck stop booth she had stopped at while visiting her daughter, who lived in the area. She had almost thrown it away. The paper was slightly worn, the way paper gets when it has been handled more than once, but she had unfolded it and looked at the photograph, and something had happened inside her chest that she described, when she finally told the story, as a door opening in a dark room. She recognized Ray Calloway, not from a missing persons flyer, not from a news segment, from his face at her counter, which she had served coffee to on the morning of March 5th, 2002, one day after he had disappeared from Elk City. 300 miles west of where anyone had ever thought to look. What Estelle Briggs remembered about that morning, and what she would spend the next several weeks carefully reconstructing with investigators, a retired woman's memory proving sharper and more detailed than anyone who had not known Estelle Briggs might have expected, was this: Ray Calloway had not been alone. The investigation that would follow Estelle's phone call would become one of the most significant cold case developments in Oklahoma and Texas in recent memory. But before we get to what investigators found, and before we get to what Nora Calloway heard on that Tuesday evening that made her pull her truck to the side of the road and sit in the dark for 40 minutes unable to speak, we need to understand who Ray Calloway was and what his disappearance did to the family he left behind on Sycamore Street. Ray Calloway was 34 years old in March 2002. He had been driving long-haul routes for 11 years, working for a company called Southwestern Freight Solutions out of Oklahoma City. He was, by every account that investigators gathered in the weeks after his disappearance, exactly the kind of man who does not simply vanish. Methodical, reliable, the kind of driver who called dispatch when he stopped for fuel, who logged every mile, who kept his rig in maintenance condition that other drivers noticed and commented on. His supervisor, a man named Dale Hutchins, told the Beckham County Sheriff's Office in 2002 that Ray had never once missed a scheduled check-in in 11 years of employment. Not once, not during ice storms, not during mechanical trouble, not during any of the small emergencies and detours and complications that accumulated across 11 years of long-haul driving through the American Southwest. The absence of a check-in was, Dale Hutchins said, the first thing that told him something was wrong. Before the missed delivery, before the unanswered phone calls, the silence from Ray's CB and his cell was the alarm, because Ray Calloway simply did not go silent. His wife, Sandra Calloway, had understood this about him in the particular way that the spouses of long-haul drivers understand their partners through the rhythm of contact, the steady pulse of calls and check-ins that structured the days Ray spent on the road and gave shape to the days Sandra spent at home in Elk City with Nora. Sandra worked as a dental hygienist. She was 31 in 2002, dark-haired and practical, a woman who had built her life around the reliable rhythms of a husband who was away half the time and fully present the other half. She had never been afraid of his absences. She had learned to read them the way sailors read weather, not as threats, but as information, navigable with the right preparation. When the check-in call didn't come by 6 p.m., on March 4th, she had called his cell. No answer. She had called dispatch. Dale Hutchins had told her they hadn't heard from him either, but that it wasn't yet outside the range of possible explanations. Traffic, a dead zone, a phone running low. By 9 p.m., when the second check-in window passed in silence, Sandra had begun the process of not breathing properly that would last in various intensities for the next 22 years. She did not fall apart in the immediate aftermath, which people who knew her and people who didn't know her both commented on in ways that had different valences. People who knew her understood it as the expression of a character that had always handled difficulty by becoming more functional, not less the same quality that made her good at her job and reliable in a crisis, and the person that friends called when they needed someone to think clearly. People who didn't know her, particularly in the early months when the investigation was most active and most public, sometimes interpreted her composure as suspicious, as if grief properly expressed could only look one way, and Sandra's version of it was somehow an argument against her innocence. She had learned to live with both interpretations, which was easier to say than to do, and which had cost her more than she ever said publicly. The years that followed were not uniform. The first year was the worst in the specific way that first years are worse the administration of it, the phone calls, the investigators, the media requests. The legal processes required to manage a household when one of its earners has vanished without documentation of death. The second year was different, quieter in ways that felt like abandonment, as the investigation contracted and the calls from the sheriff's office became less frequent, and the reporters stopped following up. By the third year, Sandra had learned the rhythm of living inside an open question, the way you organize your days when one of the central facts of your life is unresolved. How you answer the question people always eventually ask about whether you're seeing anyone with the kind of answer that neither lies nor requires a longer explanation than the situation calls for. She had not remarried. She had, eventually, after several years, gone on dates cautious, infrequent, always with the understanding that she was a woman whose husband was legally missing and whose heart had not fully arrived at the place where closure was possible. None of these had become relationships of significance, and she had not been devastated by this. She had built something instead, the adult literacy classes at the community center, which she had started in 2007 after a student at her dental office had mentioned in passing that she couldn't read the intake forms. Sandra had helped her with the forms and then had gone home and thought about it for 3 days, and then had contacted the community center. By 2024, she was teaching 3 nights a week and had helped over 200 adults achieve basic literacy. She did not think of this as sublimation. She thought of it as what she had found to do with the energy that Ray's absence had made available. Nora had been the center of everything. This was not a burden Sandra had placed on her consciously. She had been careful, relentlessly careful, not to make Nora carry the weight of being the remaining piece of a family that had broken. But children understand what they are to their parents without being told, and Nora had understood from early on that her mother's stability and her own stability were connected things, that the house on Sycamore Street held together partly because they were both in it, and that this was not a terrible thing. It was simply the shape of what they had. The search began on March 5, 2002. Oklahoma Highway Patrol. Texas Department of Public Safety. The Beckham County Sheriff's Office coordinating with counterparts across the state line. Within 48 hours, the search had expanded across 2 states and produced nothing. No accident reports on US 40 matching Ray's rig. No hospital admissions in any of the counties along his route under his name or matching his description. No witnesses who remembered seeing the blue Kenworth T680 with Oklahoma plates after the last confirmed sighting a fuel stop in Eric, Oklahoma at 7:23 a.m. On March 4th, captured on the station's security camera, Ray, visible at the pump in his jacket, zipped 3/4 of the way up. The same as always. After Eric, nothing. The truck was never found. This was the detail that distinguished Ray's disappearance from most missing persons cases involving commercial drivers, where the vehicle is typically located even when the person isn't. A 40-foot tractor trailer is not a thing that disappears quietly. It weighs nearly 80,000 pounds fully loaded. It requires specific roads, specific clearances, specific infrastructure to move and store. And yet, Ray Calloway's Kenworth T680, loaded with industrial equipment bound for Albuquerque, had ceased to exist somewhere between Eric, Oklahoma and the Texas state line as completely and mysteriously as if the highway had simply swallowed it. Investigators pursued the obvious possibilities in sequence: mechanical failure, an accident in an unmonitored area, foul play during a robbery or hijacking. Voluntary disappearance, the theory that investigators were required to consider, and that Sandra Calloway refused to consider at all, with a firmness that people who knew her recognized not as denial, but as accurate knowledge of the man she had married. There was no insurance policy that would benefit from his disappearance. There was no debt that needed escaping. There was no second life that investigators could find any trace of. There was a house on Sycamore Street with a 6-year-old girl who woke up early on departure mornings to watch her father fill his thermos. And that girl was what Ray Calloway had, that he would never willingly leave behind. The case went cold in 2004. Sandra Calloway received a letter from the Beckham County Sheriff's Office informing her that the active investigation had been suspended pending new information. She filed it in the same drawer where she kept Ray's last pay stub, his commercial driver's license renewal form that had arrived in the mail 6 weeks after he disappeared, and a birthday card he had filled out for Nora's 7th birthday and left on the kitchen counter, stamped and addressed, to be mailed while he was on the road. The card had arrived 4 days after he disappeared. Nora had kept it every year since. It said, "To my bug on her big day. 7 is the best number. I know because you're in it. Love, Dad." Sandra did not remarry. She continued working at the dental office. She continued living in the house on Sycamore Street because leaving felt like a betrayal she wasn't ready to commit, and because Nora, as she grew, needed the continuity of the house more than Sandra needed the relief of not being in it. She maintained a relationship with the Beckham County Cold Case Unit, calling every 6 months, being told there was nothing new, calling again 6 months later. She joined an online community for families of missing persons and became, in the quiet way that people who have survived long uncertainties sometimes become, a steady and patient presence for families newer to the experience than she was. She was not, people who knew her said, a woman consumed by grief. She was a woman who had metabolized grief into something denser and more functional, a permanent awareness of absence that she carried without letting it stop her from being present. Nora's relationship with her father's disappearance was different because it had begun differently. She had been 6 years old. She did not grieve the way an adult grieves, with the full cognitive weight of understanding what has been lost. She grieved the way children grieve, in patches, in questions that arrived at unexpected moments, in the particular loneliness of growing up with the shape of a person where the person should have been. She had photographs. She had her mother's stories. She had the birthday card with the words about 7 being the best number. She had the muscle memory of watching him zip his jacket 3/4 of the way up. And she had, from a very early age, a quality of attention to the world that her teachers noted and her mother recognized as inherited the same dark, steady eyes, the same sense of looking at things until they made sense. The first years were the ones Nora later said she remembered least, which she thought was her brain's way of protecting her from the full weight of what a 6-year-old cannot process. What she remembered clearly were specific moments, unconnected and out of order, the way early childhood memories always are. She remembered her mother standing at the kitchen window for a long time one afternoon, not washing dishes or doing anything, just standing. She remembered a police officer who came to the house and had very large hands and spoke to her mother in a low voice while Nora sat on the stairs pretending to play with a doll. She remembered the day a reporter knocked on the door and her mother said nothing and closed it again in a way that made the house feel suddenly very sealed. She remembered, with perfect clarity, the first time she understood that her father was not coming home soon, not understood it as a fact someone had told her, but understood it in the body, the way children understand things that adults are trying to protect them from. She had been 7, sitting in the cafeteria at school, and a boy at the next table had said something about his dad picking him up after school, and something had happened in Nora's chest that she did not have words for yet and would not have for several more years. She had been a quiet child, teachers said, not withdrawn, not troubled in the ways that school counselors watched for. She was social enough, made friends, participated, completed her work, but quiet in a particular way, as if she was always listening for something underneath the ordinary noise of childhood, some frequency that others were not tuned to. Sandra had noticed this and had done what Sandra did with difficult things, had acknowledged it without dramatizing it, had made space for it without making it the center of everything, had trusted that Nora would find her own way through because she had Ray's eyes and Ray's way of looking at things until they made sense. By the time Nora was in middle school, she had become, without fully intending to, the family archivist. She kept everything, not obsessively, not in the way that suggested she was unable to move forward, but with the methodical care of someone who understands that things become important in retrospect, and that throwing away the wrong thing too early is a mistake you cannot undo. She kept the birthday card in a cedar box under her bed, alongside a photograph of Ray taken at her 4th birthday, him on one knee, laughing at something off camera, his jacket 3/4 zipped, even indoors, because he was always cold at the ends of rooms. She kept a notebook of things her mother told her about Ray, transcribed in her careful preteen handwriting. The way he took his coffee, the radio stations he preferred on long drives, the names of 3 truckers he had considered friends and called regularly on the CB. She kept the atlas with the route traced in pencil, the pencil line now faded to near invisibility, the paper softened from handling. She had not told her friends much about any of this. Not from shame. She had understood early that there was nothing shameful about her father being missing, that it was something that had happened to him and to her family, not something any of them had done. But she had understood equally early that other people's relationship to missing persons was shaped by the news cycle and the true crime stories and the presumptions that accumulate around cases that go unsolved long enough, and she had not wanted to navigate those presumptions on top of everything else. So she had kept the searching private, a project she conducted in parallel to her visible life, the way some people keep a faith that is real and sustaining without requiring an audience. She had begun asking questions about her father's disappearance when she was 9. Not emotional questions, those she kept private, in the journal she had started keeping at her mother's suggestion after a school counselor recommended it. Practical questions. Where had he been going? What road? How far? What was at the end of that road that he was supposed to reach? She had taken out an atlas, a physical atlas, the kind that gas stations sold in the early 2000s, the kind that Ray had kept in his cab, and traced the route with her finger. US 40 West, through Elk City, through Eric, across the Texas state line, through Shamrock and Groom and Amarillo. She had traced it until she knew it. She had been 12 when she first asked her mother to drive the route with her. Sandra had said yes without hesitation, understanding before Nora had fully articulated it that this was necessary, that refusing would cost something she couldn't afford to spend. They had driven it on a Saturday in August, the two of them in Sandra's Civic, stopping at every truck stop and diner along the way, Nora looking at the faces behind the counters and the faces in the booths with the same dark, steady attention she brought to everything. They had found nothing. But something had shifted in Nora on that drive that her mother recognized and did not try to name, because some things in children are better witnessed than interpreted. When Nora turned 18, she wrote the first note. She had been thinking about it for months, what to put on it, how to make it legible and brief and specific, how to make it the kind of thing a tired person would pick up rather than ignore. She had settled on simplicity. The photograph, the name, the number, the 6 words. She had written 30 copies by hand at the kitchen table on a Friday night, her mother sitting across from her grading worksheet she had brought home from the adult literacy class she had started teaching at the community center. Neither of them had spoken much. The silence had been the kind that doesn't need filling. The next morning, Nora had driven the route, alone for the first time. She had been 18 and newly licensed, and the truck was borrowed from a neighbor, a rattling F-150 that smelled of dog and old coffee. And she had driven from Elk City to Amarillo and back in a single day, stopping everywhere she could find a counter or a bulletin board or a surface that might hold a note. And she had left one at every stop. That was in 2014. She had not stopped since. 10 years of monthly drives, 10 years of handwritten notes, the paper slightly different each year as she found better stock, the handwriting more assured as she grew into it, the photograph the same Ray at 32, 2 years before he disappeared, standing beside his rig in a truck stop parking lot outside Oklahoma City, squinting slightly into the sun, the jacket 3/4 zipped. She had laminated the photograph eventually, After an early note came back to her, sent to her home address by a diner owner in Groom, Texas, who had found it on his bulletin board and thought she should know the laminated ones held up better in the humidity. She had thanked him by letter. She had laminated all subsequent copies. The ritual of the drives had become, over the years, something she did not question and did not examine too closely, because examining it would require deciding whether it was reasonable, and reasonableness was not the point. She would leave work on the Friday afternoon before the first weekend of each month and drive the 3 hours from Tulsa to Elk City, where she would stop at her mother's house for dinner. They would eat together, the two of them, at the same kitchen table where Nora had watched her father fill his thermos on departure mornings 22 years ago. They would talk about ordinary things, Nora's work at the library, Sandra's literacy classes, the neighbor's dog, the garden. They did not always talk about Ray on those evenings. Sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't, and both were acceptable, because they had long ago negotiated the terms of how to hold his absence together without it consuming every room they shared. In the morning, Nora would drive the route. She had developed, over 10 years, a sequence for each stop that was as precise as Ray's pre-departure checklist had been. She would enter the diner or the truck stop. She would buy something coffee, always coffee, sometimes a piece of pie if it was late enough in the day. She would sit for a few minutes and look at the room the way she always looked at rooms, with the dark, steady attention that people described as her father's eyes. She would find the right spot for the note, not hidden, not obvious, but placed where a person who was settled in and had a moment to look would find it. Behind the sugar dispenser. Inside the pocket of the laminated menu. On the community board near the bathrooms. Beneath the notices for lost dogs and used appliances and local church events. She would place it there, and she would leave. She had calculated, once, how many people might have seen her notes across 10 years. The route had roughly 40 stops. She drove it once a month. Each note potentially seen by dozens of people before it was removed or fell behind something, or was simply absorbed into the background texture of a busy public space. The mathematics were enormous and entirely inconclusive. She had made peace with this. She was a librarian. She understood that you could not know in advance which book would matter to which reader at which moment. You could only make sure the books were there. The calls had come and gone, 47 of them across 10 years. She had answered every one on the first ring, pulling over if she was driving, stepping out of the library if she was working, waking fully from dead sleep if she was asleep. She had learned not to hope too hard in the first 30 seconds of each call, because hope in those seconds was a specific kind of pain she had become familiar with and had not found a way to make smaller. She answered. She listened. She thanked the caller. She followed up every lead that was followable. And she kept leaving notes. The 47th call, which had come in September of the previous year, had been the one that came closest before Estelle. A retired highway patrol officer named Gerald Moss had called from Tucumcari, New Mexico, to say he remembered a blue Kenworth broken down on the shoulder of I-40 in the spring of 2002, and that when he had stopped to check. The driver had given him a name that wasn't Ray Calloway's, but had Ray Calloway's description, down to the build and the dark hair. Gerald had not made the connection at the time because he had not known Ray was missing. The case's media coverage had been limited, and Tucumcari was outside the primary search area. Nora had passed this to the Beckham County Cold Case Unit, who had filed it and thanked her, and she had waited, and nothing had come of it. She had gone back to leaving notes. She had, over 10 years, become something she had not expected to become, a source of steadiness for other people doing the same thing she was doing. The online communities for families of missing persons were full of people in various stages of the search. People at the beginning, still sharp with shock and the adrenaline of active investigation, and people further along who had learned to carry the uncertainty in ways that didn't require constant forward motion to feel like something other than surrender. Nora occupied a specific position in these communities, young enough to have begun her search as a child, experienced enough to have arrived at a kind of peace with the practice of searching that had not required her to abandon hope. She answered questions when people had them. She shared what she had learned about note-leaving, about how to phrase things for maximum legibility, about the specific landscape of U.S. highway diners, and which ones had bulletin boards, and which ones had staff who were receptive to a brief explanation. She was not an expert in anything official. She was an expert in a very particular kind of persistence, and that expertise was, in those communities, rare and genuinely useful. She had thought about her father on the October morning she left the note that Estelle would find. Not consciously, not in the deliberate way she sometimes thought about him when she was driving the route and had hours to sit with him in the cab of her memory. She had thought about him in the way she always thought about him on these drives, as a presence she was moving toward, rather than a problem she was trying to solve, as someone she was visiting in the only geography that still held him with any specificity. She had tucked the note behind the sugar dispenser at the truck stop outside Amarillo at 11:17 in the morning. She had driven home. She had gone to work on Monday. And on Tuesday evening, her phone had rung with an Oklahoma area code she didn't recognize, and she had pulled over to answer it because she always pulled over to answer calls she didn't recognize. On the morning of March 5, 2002, the day after Ray Calloway disappeared from the US 40 corridor, Estelle had been working the breakfast shift at the Crossroads Diner, 12 miles outside Amarillo on the old highway. She had been 59 years old then, 22 years into her 31 years at that counter, and she had developed the particular memory for faces that people who work counters develop when they have served thousands of them, a filing system that operated below the level of conscious thought, matching faces to orders and small personal details with the automatic efficiency of long practice. She had always said that she remembered faces the way other people remembered songs, not every lyric, but enough to hum the tune and know exactly when she had heard it. Ray Calloway had come in at 7:40 in the morning. She remembered the time because the breakfast rush had not yet started, and she had been restocking the coffee station when the bell above the door announced him. She remembered his face because it was the kind of face that looks like it belongs somewhere else, not troubled, not suspicious, but displaced. The face of a man sitting in a diner booth 12 miles outside Amarillo when some part of him was clearly still somewhere on the road behind him, turning something over that hadn't finished turning. She had brought him coffee. He had ordered eggs and toast. He had eaten quickly, the way drivers eat when they are behind schedule or have somewhere more important to be than where they currently are. He had been polite, thank you. Yes, please. The kind of automatic courtesy that people who spend a lot of time in service establishments develop as a second nature. The recognition that the person behind the counter is a person. And she had noticed this was the detail that had stayed with her across 22 years. The one that surfaced whole and specific when she looked at the photograph on Nora's note and felt that door open in the dark room of memory. She had noticed the jacket. Dark green, zipped 3/4 of the way up. Not all the way. She had thought at the time that it was chilly enough that November morning to zip a jacket all the way. And the 3/4 detail had registered as a small personal quirk, the kind that the counter-filing memory preserves without instruction, because it is precisely these small idiosyncrasies that distinguish one face from 1,000 others, which she had not mentioned to anyone in 22 years because no one had asked her the right question, and because she had not known until she saw the photograph that she had anything to contribute, was that Ray had not been alone in the diner that morning. He had been sitting across from a woman. The woman had not ordered anything. She had sat with her hands around a cup of coffee that Estelle had poured for her and had not eaten and had not spoken loudly enough for Estelle to hear from the counter. She was younger than Ray. Estelle thought late 20s, perhaps early 30s. Dark hair pulled back simply, no jewelry that Estelle could see, dressed in practical clothes that suggested she had packed for function rather than comfort. She had not looked comfortable, not frightened in the way that would have prompted Estelle to intervene, not the kind of uncomfortable that asked for help. But not at ease either. She had the quality of someone who is somewhere they need to be rather than somewhere they want to be, which Estelle had seen enough times in 31 years at a highway diner to recognize as its own distinct category of human experience. She had watched Ray eat. She had not touched the coffee after the first sip. When he finished, he had said something to her. Estelle couldn't hear the words from the counter, and the woman had nodded once and stood up. Ray had paid in cash. Exact change. The tip had been slightly more than standard, the kind of tip left by a person who is aware that they have not been much of a customer and wants to acknowledge it without making a scene. Estelle had watched them leave together through the diner window. They had walked to a truck parked at the far end of the lot, away from the fuel pumps, backed in so the cab faced the highway. Blue, long, A-rig, definitely, and after they got in, it had sat in that parking lot for almost 20 minutes before pulling out west. She had not thought about this in 22 years. She had not had reason to. But the photograph on Nora's note had reached into the filing system with the specific efficiency of a perfect match, and what it had retrieved was complete: the jacket, the tip, the exact change transaction, the woman who didn't touch her coffee, the truck sitting in the lot before pulling west. Estelle Briggs was 81 years old, and her memory for faces had not diminished the way other things had, and she had called the number on the note before she talked herself out of it, which was, she told the investigator who interviewed her 2 weeks later, the most important decision she had made in a very long time. The Beckham County Sheriff's Office reopened the case the following week. The Texas Rangers were contacted. The FBI's Cold Case Division assigned an agent named Patricia Duvall, who had spent 14 years working missing persons cases and who approached the Calloway file with the methodical patience that distinguished investigators who were good at cold cases from investigators who merely worked them. What they found, working outward from Estelle Briggs's account, was not a quick answer. It was a slow accumulation of detail, a receipt found in an archive storage facility in Shamrock, Texas, a witness statement from a gas station attendant who had retired to Arizona, and whose memory, like Estelle's, proved sharper than anyone had expected. A name on a rental record from a motel in Tucumcari that matched neither Ray Calloway nor the name the highway patrol officer had been given, but that investigators were able to connect through a chain of documentation that took 3 months to fully reconstruct. Nora Calloway pulled her truck to the side of the road outside Tulsa on a Tuesday evening in October 2024 and sat in the dark for 40 minutes. She did not cry immediately. She sat with the phone still warm in her hand, and she looked at the dashboard, and she went through what Estelle had told her with the systematic attention she brought to everything, arranging the facts in the order they needed to be in. Her father had been alive on March 5th. He had been in Amarillo. He had not been alone. He had left the diner with a woman. The truck had sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before moving. These were facts. They were not comfort. They were not answers. But they were something that 22 years of notes and 47 phone calls had never produced before. They were a thread. She called her mother first. Sandra Calloway listened without interrupting, which was how Sandra listened to everything important. When Nora finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that Nora said, "Mom," and Sandra said, "I'm here. I'm just sitting with it." And they stayed on the phone without speaking for another minute. Two women in different cities in the dark, sitting with the first new information about Ray Calloway that either of them had received in 20 years. The Beckham County Sheriff's Office reopened the case the following week. The Texas Rangers were contacted. The FBI's Cold Case Division, which had developed significantly more resources in the 2 decades since Ray's disappearance, assigned an agent named Patricia Duval to coordinate the investigation. What they found, working outward from Estelle Briggs's account, was not a quick answer. Cold cases rarely produce quick answers. They produce, instead, a slow accumulation of detail that eventually reaches a point where the shape of what happened becomes visible. What the shape revealed over the following months was this: Ray Calloway had not been the victim of a highway robbery or an accident. He had made contact, sometime in the days before his March 4th departure, with a woman who had needed to leave a situation she could not leave through official channels. The details of that situation and of how Ray, a man whose capacity for practical problem-solving was well documented by everyone who knew him, had come to be involved, were reconstructed piece by piece through records and interviews and the particular investigative patience that cold cases demand. Her name was Delia Marsh. She had been 29 in 2002, living in Shamrock, Texas, in circumstances that investigators were careful in their language about, and that Delia herself, when she was eventually found living quietly in New Mexico, under a name she had adopted 22 years ago, described without evasion as a situation she had needed to escape with someone's help, and without leaving a trail. Ray had been that help. He had not planned it. He had stopped at a gas station in Shamrock on the evening of March 4th, and he had encountered Delia in the kind of distress that a man with Ray Calloway's character was constitutionally unable to ignore. He had made a decision in the space of a single conversation that had altered the course of his life and his daughter's life and his wife's life in ways he could not have fully calculated in that moment. He had helped her disappear, and in doing so, he had effectively disappeared himself. The full account of where Ray had gone after the Crossroads Diner of the years between March 2002 and the present took longer to establish than the investigation into how he had come to be there. It took longer because the answer was not simple, and because Ray Calloway, when investigators finally located him in April 2025, was not the man who had kissed his daughter's head on a Monday morning in Elk City 23 years before. He was 57 years old. He was living in a small town in Colorado where he had worked for 19 years as a mechanic for a local trucking company, which had a symmetry to it that Nora, when she learned it, could not decide whether was painful or fitting or simply true. He had not used his real name since 2002. He had built a life that was, by the measures available to him, a real one steady work, a small house, a community of people who knew him as the version of himself he had become after Ray Calloway had driven away from Shamrock, Texas, with a woman who needed to disappear. He had not contacted Sandra or Nora. This was the fact that took the longest to account for and that required the most careful and honest telling, because it was the fact that hurt the most, and it deserved to be hurt by. He had watched from a careful distance the public aspects of the search, the news coverage in 2002. The brief resurgence when a reporter had done a 10-year anniversary story in 2012. The missing persons website that Sandra had maintained for years. He had known they were looking. He had known what the looking cost them. And he had stayed away because the calculus of returning had year by year produced the same impossible result. The cost of coming back after so much time, with so much to explain, felt like a weight he could not ask his family to carry. This was not a justification. It was an explanation. There is a difference, and Ray Calloway understood it, and he said so clearly. What he had not known, because it was not something the public missing persons record could show him, was Nora's notes. He had not known that his daughter had been driving US 40 every month for 10 years, leaving his photograph in diners and truck stops. When investigators told him when they showed him one of the notes, the laminated photograph, the 6 handwritten words he did not speak for a long time. The investigator, who was present later, said that Ray Calloway looked at that note the way a person looks at something that simultaneously confirms and destroys everything they have told themselves to make an impossible situation bearable. Sandra Calloway received this information with the particular processing speed of a woman who had been preparing for it, in some form, for 22 years. She was 53 years old, and she had built a life inside the absence of her husband that was real and full in hers, and the return of Ray Calloway to the category of the living did not dismantle that life. It complicated it. It asked questions of her that she was not required to answer immediately, and she did not. She asked for time, which investigators granted, and she sat with it for 3 days before she called Nora. And when she called, she said, "I don't know what I feel yet. And I think that's the honest answer. And I thought you should know that, so you don't think you have to feel something clear either." Nora had said, "I love you, Mom." Sandra had said, "I know. I love you too. We'll figure out the rest." The question of what came next for Nora and Ray, for Sandra and Ray, for the three of them in the 23 years between the morning he left and the spring afternoon when investigators found him in Colorado, was not a question that had an answer in the months immediately following. It was a question that belonged to the longer arc of things, to the particular slow work of people deciding what they owe each other after a rupture of that magnitude and duration. Ray wrote to them. Nora read the letter several times and put it in the cedar box under the bed, with the birthday card and the photograph and the faded atlas with the pencil line. She did not write back immediately. She was not ready, and she did not pretend to be. Nora Calloway drove the route one more time in May 2025, not to leave notes. She had left her last note in October 2024, the day before Estelle Briggs's phone call, at a truck stop outside Shamrock, Texas, and she had not left one since. She drove the route because she needed to drive it once more, knowing what she now knew, what the road had held for 22 years, what her notes had floated through, what her father had been doing on the morning she had pulled off the highway and walked into diners with her laminated photograph and her handwritten words. She stopped at the Crossroads Diner outside Amarillo. Estelle Briggs was not there. She had retired in 2019, and her daughter had moved her to assisted living in Lubbock the previous year. But the booth was there. The sugar dispenser was there. Nora sat down in the booth and ordered coffee and eggs and looked out the window at the parking lot where a blue rig had sat for 20 minutes on a March morning in 2002 before pulling away toward whatever came next. She did not know yet what her relationship with her father would become. She did not know if it would become anything. She knew that he was alive, which was the thing she had spent 22 years needing to know, and she knew that the knowing was different from what she had imagined, more complicated and less clean, the answer to one question opening into a room full of others. She finished her coffee. She paid. She left a tip that was slightly more than standard. Not lavish, slightly more. The kind left by a person who is aware that they have been a minimal customer, that they have taken up a booth and ordered only coffee and used the space for something the diner had not advertised. She did this without deciding to. She only noticed it when she was standing at the register and the math had already been done and the bills were already in her hand. She walked out to her truck and sat for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the dashboard the way she had looked at it on a Tuesday evening in October, when the world had rearranged itself around a phone call from an 81-year-old woman who had kept a memory for 22 years without knowing she was keeping it. There were over 800 notes somewhere in the world, in bathroom stalls and behind condiment holders and on community bulletin boards, and tucked into the pages of logbooks that drivers had long since discarded or misplaced. Most of them had been thrown away. A few had been kept by people who didn't know why they kept them. One had been found at exactly the right moment by exactly the right woman, which was either luck or the result of 22 years of refusing to accept that looking was something you could afford to stop doing. Nora Calloway had spent 22 years believing that the answer to any question is somewhere, written down, waiting for the right person to find it. She was a librarian. She believed this about books, and she had believed it about her father, and she had been right in ways she was still working out how to hold. The answer had not been clean. The answer had been a man in Colorado who was alive and had chosen to stay disappeared, which was not the answer she had imagined across 22 years of driving the route and leaving notes and answering calls on the first ring. It was harder than that answer. It required more of her. It asked questions she had not yet decided how to answer about forgiveness and family and what a father is when you remove the years of presence that the word usually implies. She started the engine. She pulled out of the parking lot. She drove east on the old highway toward home, the same road her father had driven west 23 years before. And the distance between those two directions, east and west, leaving and returning, the morning he had kissed the top of her head, and the afternoon she sat in a diner booth where he had once sat, was both enormous and, for the first time, measurable. It had a number. 22 years. 800 notes. One phone call. One woman who had poured coffee and never forgotten a jacket zipped 3/4 of the way up. Some searches end with the thing you were looking for. Some end with something more complicated than the thing you were looking for. Something that requires you to become larger than the question in order to hold the answer. Nora Calloway had been 6 years old when her father drove away. She was 28 when she learned where he had gone. In between, she had driven a road more than 200 times, left her name and her number and her father's face at every stop along it, and waited, not passively, not helplessly, but with the specific active patience of a person who knows that showing up, repeatedly and consistently, in the same place, with the same question, is itself a form of answer, a way of saying to the universe, I am still here, and I am still asking, and I have not decided yet that asking is something I need to stop. She drove east. The Texas Panhandle opened on both sides of the road, flat and vast, and lit with the particular gold of late afternoon on open land. She thought about Estelle Briggs, 81 years old, in a truck stop booth, reaching behind a sugar dispenser with the casual movement of a person stretching, finding a piece of paper, unfolding it, looking at a face she had served eggs and toast to on a March morning 22 years ago, and picking up the phone. She thought about what it cost to keep a memory that long without knowing it's worth keeping, and about what it means when that cost turns out to have been paid for something real. The road is long and full of people moving through it in all directions, carrying things they cannot set down. Most of what they carry passes through without leaving a trace. But sometimes, in a booth at a highway diner outside Amarillo, an old woman finds a piece of paper that someone put there on purpose, for exactly this moment, and she picks up the phone, and everything that has been waiting to be found finally is. Some people are found because someone never stopped looking. That is not a small thing. It is, in the end, the only thing that ever really was.